The dust of Fort Hemlock swirled around Sergeant Eleanor Vance's worn combat boots, a familiar dance partner in the relentless Georgia heat. Each gust carried with it the faint, metallic tang of fuel, a constant reminder of the base's lifeblood and her current headache. At 32, Eleanor possessed the kind of quiet strength that often went unnoticed, especially in a world that preferred bluster. Her frame was lean, honed by years of physical training, and the kind of steadfast dedication that saw her through every grueling exercise. Her eyes, the color of a storm-laden sky, held a sharp intelligence, though they were often shadowed by an unspoken weariness. Today, however, the weariness was amplified. She was on her way to the motor pool, a place that, despite being her domain, felt more like a cage of judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Thorne, a man whose ambition was as polished as his uniform buttons, had made sure of that. Thorne embodied everything Eleanor disdained: arrogance born of privilege, a penchant for cutting corners, and a casual cruelty disguised as leadership. He'd arrived at Fort Hemlock 6 months ago, bringing with him a wave of modernization that mostly translated to increased bureaucracy and a palpable shift in morale downwards. Eleanor was a master of logistics, a veritable magician when it came to ensuring every vehicle, every piece of equipment, every single gallon of fuel was accounted for. It was a thankless job, often overlooked until something went wrong, and then suddenly everyone was looking. And usually looking at her. She'd built her reputation brick by painstaking brick through deployments where her meticulous planning had saved lives and resources. But Thorne saw none of that. To him, she was just Sergeant Vance, a woman in a man's world, a perpetual thorn in his side with her insistence on proper procedure. Her current assignment was the fuel depot, a sprawling network of tanks and pipelines that powered the entire base. 50,000 gallons, give or take a few hundred, were supposed to be transferred from a main supply line to the base's reserve tanks, a routine operation on paper. In reality, it was a delicate ballet of valves, pressure gauges, and precise timing, and it was going wrong. As she neared the motor pool, the cacophony of engines and the shouts of mechanics grew louder. She spotted Thorne immediately, his silver hair gleaming under the afternoon sun, surrounded by a cluster of junior officers. He was pontificating as usual, his voice carrying an air of self-importance that grated on Eleanor's nerves. "And I expect these numbers to be reconciled by end of day. Sergeant Vance," he was saying, though not looking at her. He was addressing Captain Miller, a young, eager officer who seemed perpetually on the verge of saluting. Thorne finally turned, his gaze sweeping over Eleanor with a dismissive air. "Unless, of course, you're having trouble keeping track of a few drops of fuel, A snicker rippled through the small group. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her jaw. She met Thorne's gaze, her expression unyielding. "The initial readings are off, sir," she stated, her voice calm despite the churning in her gut. "The transfer logs don't match the supply reports. It's a significant discrepancy," Thorne scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. A clerical error, I'm sure. Your job is to make the numbers work, Sergeant, not to invent problems." "My job is to ensure accuracy, sir," Eleanor corrected, her voice firm. "And the numbers aren't working. We're short by almost 10,000 gallons based on the initial transfer." Now, a genuine ripple of concern went through the other officers. 10,000 gallons was not a few drops. That was enough to ground an entire squadron of helicopters. Thorne's face flushed. He prided himself on efficiency, and a missing 10,000 gallons of fuel made him look incompetent. "Are you suggesting someone stole it, Sergeant?" he sneered, making the word "stole" sound ridiculous. "Right here, under our noses?" "I'm suggesting we have a leak, a miscalculation, or something worse, sir," Eleanor replied, refusing to be baited. "And I need to investigate the lines immediately." "You'll do no such thing," Thorne barked. "You will go back to your office, reconcile those reports, and produce a set of numbers that reflect the proper transfer. This base does not tolerate sensationalism." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for her, though everyone nearby could still hear. "Do you understand, Sergeant? You're making us look bad, And I don't tolerate insubordination from a paper pusher. The insult hung in the air, a venomous dart aimed squarely at her heart. Paper pusher. It was a term he'd used before, a subtle way of reminding her of her gender in a male-dominated field, of implying her work was less important, less demanding than the real soldiers. Eleanor felt a surge of cold fury, but she kept her face impassive. Years of military discipline had taught her to control her reactions, to channel her emotions into resolve. "Understood, sir," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. She snapped a crisp salute, turned on her heel, and walked away, the taunts and snickers of Thorne's cronies echoing in her ears. As she retreated, the words "paper pusher" gnawed at her. She wasn't just a paper pusher. She was the architect of order, the guardian of resources. She knew the fuel lines of Fort Hemlock better than she knew the back of her own hand, knew the subtle hum of a healthy pump, the faint tremor of a failing valve, and something in her gut was screaming that this wasn't just a clerical error. Back in her cramped office, the air conditioner struggled against the oppressive heat. Stacks of forms, ledgers, and maintenance reports threatened to bury her. She sat at her metal desk pulling up the digital logs. The numbers danced before her eyes, an infuriating riddle. She rechecked the inbound manifests, the outbound requisitions, the daily consumption reports. Everything pointed to a massive discrepancy. 50,000 gallons were supposed to have arrived. The base's storage showed 40,000. 10,000 gallons vanished into thin air. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She was good at her job, damn good. This wasn't a mistake on her part. She thought back to the transfer itself. It had been overseen by a new, inexperienced team, rushed into place by Thorne to cut costs. He'd overridden her recommendations for a more seasoned crew. He always did that. Her expertise was a threat to his authority, a quiet challenge to his superficial competence. She remembered the strange, faint smell of gasoline in the air that morning, more persistent than usual, even for the fuel depot. She'd dismissed it then, attributing it to a small spill, easily evaporating in the heat. But now it niggled at her. What if it wasn't a spill? What if it was a leak? A big one? Her mind, precise and logical, began to piece together fragments of information. The unusually low pressure readings reported during the transfer. The slightly muddy patch she'd noticed near an old, disused section of the pipeline network just outside the perimeter fence. It was an area Thorne had deemed non-critical and had refused to allocate maintenance resources to, despite her repeated requests. A cold dread began to settle over her. If there was a major leak, 10,000 gallons wasn't just a loss of resources. It was an environmental disaster waiting to happen. It was a fire hazard. It was a catastrophic failure of infrastructure, a direct consequence of Thorne's negligence and his willful ignorance of her warnings. She knew what she had to do. Despite Thorne's direct order, she couldn't ignore this. Her duty wasn't to a superior officer's fragile ego. It was to the base, to its personnel, and to the mission. She grabbed her flashlight, her multi-tool, and her comms device. She would conduct her own inspection, quietly, systematically. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Most of the personnel were heading for the mess hall or their barracks. This was her chance. She slipped out of her office, blending into the shadows, a lone figure driven by a deep sense of responsibility and a simmering resentment. She moved with purpose, her boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the older sections of the fuel lines. The air grew heavier with the scent of pine and damp earth, mingling subtly with that metallic fuel odor she remembered. She approached the patch of ground she'd noted earlier, just beyond a rusted chain-link fence, overgrown with thorny bushes. As she got closer, the smell became undeniable, stronger, more potent. It wasn't just a faint trace. It was a definite, unsettling presence. She shone her flashlight on the ground. The soil was darker here, glistening faintly. And then she saw it. A slow, steady seep. A dark, viscous liquid pooling in the indentations of the earth, glinting ominously under her beam. It was fuel. Not just a few drops. A significant amount. Her heart sank. This wasn't a clerical error. This was real. And it was happening right now. She followed the trail of damp earth, her flashlight beam cutting through the gathering dusk. The pipeline, old and corroded, snaked its way through the undergrowth. And there, where a patch of rust had completely eaten through the metal, was a steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Each drop a precious resource. Each drop a testament to negligence. Each drop a ticking time bomb. Eleanor pulled out her comms device, her fingers hovering over the call button for base command. But then she hesitated. If she reported this now, it would be a direct defiance of Thorne's orders. He would find a way to discredit her, to bury the truth, to make her the scapegoat. She knew his type. He would spin it, twist it, paint her as in... The rhythmic drip of fuel onto the saturated earth was like a metronome counting down to disaster. Standing there in the cool Georgia twilight, Eleanor Vance felt a profound sense of isolation. She was a sergeant in the United States Army, a link in a chain of command built on trust and integrity, yet she was utterly alone. Reporting this through official channels was a dead end. Thorne would squash it, bury her career, and let the poison seep into the ground until it was too late. The words paper pusher echoed in her mind, not as an insult anymore, but as a challenge. A paper pusher deals in facts, in evidence, and that's exactly what she needed. Her first move was to document. Taking out her personal cell phone, a violation of protocol in this restricted area but a necessary risk, she began taking pictures. She photographed the corroded pipe, the steady leak, the dark, spreading stain on the ground. She used the flashlight to illuminate the details, the serial numbers on the pipeline segment, the brittle, flaking rust, the way the fuel was beginning to pool and flow in a slow, greasy rivulet towards a ditch that ran parallel to the fence. She knew this ditch. It fed into Hemlock Creek, a small waterway that snaked its way through the woods and eventually passed by the edge of the small town of Harmony Creek, just a few miles downstream. The thought sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. This wasn't just about missing fuel or a failure of base infrastructure anymore. This was about the health and safety of civilians, the water they drank, the ground their children played on. The weight of her discovery grew heavier, pressing down on her with an almost physical force. 10,000 gallons of fuel seeping into the local water table was not just a problem. It was a catastrophe. Returning to her office, Eleanor felt like a spy in her own life. She moved with a newfound caution, every glance from a passing soldier feeling like an accusation. She couldn't shake the feeling that Thorne was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She spent the next hour meticulously downloading the photos to a secure, encrypted drive, then deleted them from her phone. She created a separate file, a digital timeline of events. Her initial discovery of the discrepancy, her conversation with Thorne, his dismissive order, and now, the photographic evidence of the leak. Every detail was noted with clinical precision, but pictures and logs weren't enough. She needed a witness. She needed someone with credibility, someone who understood the mechanics of the base, and most importantly, someone who despised Thorne's brand of leadership as much as she did. The name came to her instantly, Master Sergeant Frank Miller. Frank was a relic from a different era. He'd been working on Army engines since before Eleanor was born. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his face a roadmap of wrinkles earned through years of hard work and a fair amount of skepticism. He was gruff, spoke in short, clipped sentences, and had zero patience for fools, especially fools with shiny brass on their collars. He was also nearing retirement, which meant he had less to lose and a finely tuned sense of what was right. He had always treated Eleanor with a gruff sort of respect, seeing the skilled professional beneath the uniform, not just the gender. The next evening, after the motor pool had emptied out and the only sounds were the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the base generator, Eleanor found Frank in his workshop. He was methodically cleaning a set of wrenches, his movements economical and practiced. "Master Sergeant?" Eleanor began, her voice quiet. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Vance? Thought you'd be home by now." "I need to talk to you, Frank, off the record. The phrase off the record made him pause. He put down the wrench and wiped his hands on an already filthy rag, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Eleanor took a breath. She laid it all out for him. The 50,000-gallon transfer, the 10,000-gallon discrepancy, her confrontation with Thorne, and his direct order to falsify the reports. Finally, she pulled out her tablet and showed him the pictures she had taken. Frank leaned in, his eyes squinting at the screen. He swiped through the images slowly, his expression growing grimmer with each one. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the picture of the corroded pipe, the dark liquid dripping steadily. Finally, he looked up at her, his gaze sharp. "You're picking a fight with a bear, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thorne will crucify you for this. Insubordination, conduct unbecoming, you name it. He'll bury you under so much paperwork you'll never see the sun again." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "But look at where it's leaking, Frank. That ditch leads to Hemlock Creek. This is bigger than me and Thorne." "It's bigger than the base," Frank grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. He ran a hand over his short, graying hair. "I remember that section of pipe. Put in a work order for a full inspection and replacement 2 years ago. It was old then, a disaster waiting to happen." "What happened to the work order?" Eleanor asked, a sliver of hope cutting through her anxiety. "Got kicked back. Insufficient priority. Then Thorne took over, and I put in another request 6 months ago. Told him that line was a critical failure point." Frank's eyes hardened. "You know what he said?" "He said it was an unnecessary expense. Said the funds were being reallocated for base beautification." "Beautification?" Eleanor repeated, incredulous. "Yeah," Frank snorted. "Repaving the parking lot at the officers' club and planting some new rose bushes around his headquarters. Priorities, you know. This was it. The missing piece. It wasn't just negligence. It was a deliberate choice. Thorne had actively chosen cosmetic upgrades over critical infrastructure over safety. Can you find that paperwork, Frank?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "The denied work orders?" Frank gave a slow, grim smile. "Thorne's a fool for digital. Thinks if it ain't on a computer, it doesn't exist. But I'm old school. I keep hard copies. Everything." For the next 2 nights, they met in secret in the dusty, cavernous records room adjacent to the motor pool. Surrounded by towering metal shelves groaning under the weight of decades of military bureaucracy, they sifted through file cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. It was a tedious, painstaking search, but Frank knew his system. Finally, late on the second night, he pulled out a folder. "Pay dirt," he whispered, laying it on the table. Inside were Eleanor's own maintenance requests, along with Frank's for the pipeline section in question, and on the bottom of each one in sharp, arrogant red ink was the word "denied," followed by Lieutenant Colonel Sterling Thorne's unmistakable signature. They also found the budget reallocation forms, diverting tens of thousands of dollars from infrastructure maintenance to the very projects Frank had mentioned. Eleanor felt a surge of validation, quickly followed by a cold wave of anger. The proof was right here in black and white and red ink. He couldn't deny this. He couldn't spin this away. During the day, the pressure from Thorne was becoming unbearable. He would stop her in the hallway, his voice dripping with condescending concern. "Making any progress on those numbers, Sergeant? I'd hate to have to report your inefficiency to the base commander." In morning briefings, he would single her out, asking pointed questions about fuel logistics that were designed to trip her up, to make her look incompetent in front of her peers. Eleanor weathered the storm, her face a mask of military professionalism. She gave him nothing, her report simply stating that the investigation into the discrepancy was ongoing. Her defiance only fueled his anger. He assigned her mind-numbing inventory tasks, forcing her to count every last nut and bolt in the supply depot, anything to keep her away from the fuel logs and chained to a desk. She felt the walls closing in, the stress coiling in her stomach. But at night, in the dusty archives with Frank, her resolve hardened. They weren't just colleagues now. They were conspirators, bound by a shared sense of duty that transcended rank. On the third day, just as they were compiling their evidence into a coherent file, the world outside the base fence intruded. A local farmer, whose land bordered Hemlock Creek, noticed an oily sheen on the water where his cattle drank. He smelled the faint, unfamiliar odor of petroleum. Worried, he did what any responsible citizen would do. He called the county's Environmental Protection Agency. The news traveled fast in a small town. An EPA inspector was dispatched. The report of a potential fuel leak in Hemlock Creek hit the local news wire. The call came for Eleanor late in the afternoon. Thorne's aide, a nervous young lieutenant, told her the lieutenant colonel wanted to see her in his office. Immediately. As she walked down the long, polished hallway towards his office, she saw them, 2 military police officers, standing at parade rest on either side of his door. They didn't look at her, but their presence was a clear and chilling message. This wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush. Thorne knew the EPA was involved. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and he was panicking. He needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall for the missing fuel, the environmental damage, the whole impending disaster. And he had chosen her. Eleanor paused for a fraction of a second, took a deep, steadying breath, and pushed the door open, ready for the storm to break. The polished wood of Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's door felt cold and final under Eleanor's hand. She pushed it open and stepped inside, her posture ramrod straight, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. The air in the office was frigid, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside. Thorne sat behind his massive oak desk, a picture of calm authority. But Eleanor could see the faint tightness around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw. He wasn't calm. He was a predator waiting for his prey to walk into the trap. He was not alone. To his right stood Captain Miller, the young officer from the motor pool, his face pale and his eyes fixed on a point just above Eleanor's head, refusing to meet her gaze. To the left, sitting in a leather chair with a notepad balanced on his knee, was a man Eleanor didn't know. He was a major, his uniform crisp, his face stern and impassive. His insignia identified him as a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a military lawyer. The trap was not just set. It was ready to be sprung. "Sergeant Vance, thank you for coming," Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk, a chilling departure from his usual abrasive tone. "This is Major Thompson from the JAG office. He's here to observe." Eleanor gave the major a curt nod. "Sir?" Thorne steepled his fingers, leaning forward slightly. "Sergeant, we have a very serious situation. As you know, there has been a significant discrepancy in our fuel inventory. Furthermore, we now have a confirmed environmental contamination event in Hemlock Creek, which the EPA has traced back to this installation." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the silent room. "A full investigation was launched this morning, and I'm afraid it has led us to some deeply disturbing conclusions." He slid a thin file across his desk. "These are the finalized fuel transfer logs for the 50,000-gallon shipment signed off by the transfer team." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She knew for a fact those logs hadn't been finalized because of the discrepancy. "This was a fabrication. The logs show a complete and successful transfer," Thorne continued, his voice hardening. "Every gallon accounted for. Yet, 10,000 gallons are missing from the reserve tanks, and a significant amount of fuel has been found leaking from a pipeline, I might add, that shows clear signs of recent and deliberate tampering." The accusation was so audacious, so completely inverted from the truth, that for a moment Eleanor was speechless. Deliberate tampering? He was twisting her discovery into a crime. "Furthermore," Thorne pressed on, his gaze like ice, "we have a sworn statement from a soldier who witnessed you near that restricted section of the pipeline after dark, acting in a highly suspicious manner. He saw you near the valve junctions, alone, without authorization." Eleanor found her voice, keeping it low and steady. "Sir, I was investigating the source of the discrepancy I reported to you. The pipeline is corroded. It's been leaking for days." Thorne gave a short, humorless laugh. "Ah, yes, your discrepancy. A convenient story. Major Thompson, what we have here is a classic case of misdirection. Sergeant Vance was the sole logistical supervisor for this transfer. When her theft was about to be discovered, she concocted a story about a leak and a discrepancy to cover her tracks. It seems she even damaged the pipeline herself to create a smokescreen, to make the theft of 10,000 gallons of fuel look like an unfortunate accident. He was painting a masterpiece of lies, each brushstroke designed to corner her. He made her diligence sound like criminal cunning, her sense of duty like a cover for greed. Captain Miller shifted his weight, still refusing to look at her. He knew the truth. He had been there when she'd first raised the alarm, but he remained silent, a pawn in Thorne's vicious game. "That is absolutely false, sir," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the stale air. "I have documentation. I submitted maintenance requests for that exact section of pipeline months ago. Master Sergeant Frank Miller can corroborate that. Those requests were denied. By you." Thorne smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Master Sergeant Miller? The disgruntled mechanic who is weeks away from a less-than-stellar retirement? An interesting choice for an accomplice. Major, please note Sergeant Vance's attempt to implicate others." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a commander betrayed. "The evidence, unfortunately, is overwhelming. The falsified reports you were ordered to correct, your unauthorized presence at what is now a crime scene, the missing fuel, it all points to you, Sergeant." Major Thompson finally spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Sergeant Vance, given the gravity of these allegations, theft of government property valued at over $50,000 and causing a major environmental hazard, you are hereby placed under formal investigation. You are to be confined to your quarters pending a preliminary hearing. Your access to all base computer systems is revoked. You are forbidden from contacting any personnel connected with the motor pool or the fuel depot. This includes Master Sergeant Miller." He looked at her, his eyes offering no hint of sympathy. "Do you understand?" The words hit her like physical blows. Confined to quarters, cut off, isolated, framed. The system she had dedicated her life to, the uniform she wore with such pride, was now being used as a weapon against her. She could see the entire path laid out before her: a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, federal prison. Thorne had thought of everything. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. 2 sharp knocks sounded at the door. Thorne called, "Enter," and the 2 MPs stepped inside. The reality of the situation became stark and terrifying. This was real. "MPs, please escort Sergeant Vance to her quarters. She is to remain there under guard until further notice." As they led her out, Eleanor caught one last glimpse of Thorne. He was watching her, a faint, triumphant smirk on his face. In that moment, she felt a wave of cold fury wash over her despair. He wasn't just going to ruin her life. He was going to get away with it. The walk to her barracks was the longest of her life. Soldiers stopped and stared as the MPs escorted her past, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Whispers followed her like ghosts. By the time she reached her small, sterile room, the news would be all over the base. Sergeant Vance, the thief. Her room felt like a cage. The MPs confiscated her phone and laptop. They were polite but firm. The door closed with a heavy thud, and she was left alone with the crushing weight of the injustice. She sank onto her narrow bunk, the springs groaning in protest. For the first time in her military career, she felt truly, utterly defeated. She had played by the rules, done her duty, and in return, her world had been dismantled by the lies of a petty, arrogant man. Hours passed. The sun set and her room filled with shadows. Despair was a cold companion. Every option seemed like a dead end. Frank was her only hope, but Thorne had cut her off from him. How could she fight back when she was trapped, silenced, and already pronounced guilty? As darkness settled completely, she stared out the small window, watching the routine of the base go on without her. She saw the guards for her barracks block begin their shift change. In the brief, predictable moment of distraction as one guard briefed the other, her eyes caught a flicker of movement down the path. It was Private Henderson, one of the youngest mechanics from the motor pool, a quiet kid Frank had taken under his wing. He was walking with his head down, looking like he was just heading back to his own barracks. He didn't look towards her window, But as he passed a large azalea bush near the corner of her building, his arm swung out in an unnatural way. Something small and white fluttered from his hand and disappeared into the leaves. He never broke his stride. A minute later, he was gone. Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs. It was a message. It had to be. Frank, he hadn't abandoned her. The knowledge sent a surge of adrenaline through her. She waited, her body tense, watching the guards. For 10 long minutes, they chatted. Then, one of them turned to make a round of the building's perimeter. This was her chance. In a flash, she was at her door, cracking it open just enough to see the other guard was looking down, scrolling on his phone. Silently, she slipped out, her bare feet making no sound on the concrete walkway. She darted to the bush, her hand plunging into the thick leaves, frantically searching. Her fingers brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper. She snatched it, retreated back into her room, and shut the door with a barely audible click. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the note under the dim sliver of light from the window. The handwriting was Frank's familiar, blocky scrawl. The message was short, and at first it made no sense at all. It was a bizarre collection of words, a code only she might understand. It read, "Thorn's roses hide the rust." The German saw it. "Stay strong. I'm working." Eleanor stared at the words, her mind racing. Thorn's roses hide the rust. The beautification project. The new rose bushes planted around headquarters, paid for with the money that should have fixed the pipeline. The rust, the corrosion. It was a reminder of the proof. But the second part? The German saw it. What German? There were no German exchange officers on the base. What could it possibly mean? It was a riddle wrapped in a mystery, but it was also a lifeline. It was a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness. Frank was out there. He was fighting for her, and he had found something. Or some confined. The word echoed in the suffocating silence of Eleanor's room. She was a soldier without a mission, a logistician without a problem to solve, trapped by the 4 pale green walls of her barracks room. Her only link to the outside world, to the fight for her own name, was the crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She smoothed it out on her knee for the 10th time, staring at Frank's cryptic message. Thorn's roses hide the rust. That part was a bitter pill, but one she understood. It was a poetic summary of Thorn's corrupt priorities, appearances over substance, manicured lawns over the corroded arteries of the base. The rust was the leak, the decay he had willfully ignored, and the roses were the beautiful, fragrant lie he had planted to cover it up. But the other part gnawed at her. The German saw it. Her mind, trained to see systems and patterns, began to work. It was a puzzle. She mentally walked through the base, cataloging personnel. There were no German exchange officers, no foreign liaisons. The phrase couldn't be literal. A German didn't see it. So what German? What on Fort Hemlock had a German connection? She paced the small room, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. The answer wasn't a person. It had to be a thing. An object. Equipment. Her thoughts flew to the motor pool, to the endless inventory lists she knew by heart. American-made Humvees, trucks, recovery vehicles, and then a flicker of memory. A complaint. A grumbling session from Frank a few months back. He'd been cursing a new acquisition, some old surplus equipment the Army had picked up for a bargain. A set of diesel generators. They were old, heavy, and stubbornly metric. None of the younger mechanics could make heads or tails of them. They were German-made. The pieces began to click into place with the satisfying precision of a well-oiled machine. One of those generators, she remembered, had been moved from the motor pool to the grounds outside the main headquarters. It was there to power the construction work for Thorn's vanity project, the very project funded by the maintenance budget. It had been positioned right by the new rose bushes, right over the path of the old corroded fuel line. Could that be it? Could a machine be a witness? The story shifted, moving across the base to the grease-stained sanctuary of the motor pool. Master Sergeant Frank Miller worked under the harsh glare of the workshop lights, his movements deliberate, but his mind racing. He felt Thorn's net tightening. He'd been questioned that afternoon by an aide from the JAG office, a fishing expedition of polite but pointed questions about his relationship with Sergeant Vance and his opinion of her work. Frank had played the part of the gruff, unobservant old-timer, answering in grunts and monosyllables. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to turn the screws on him, to paint him as Eleanor's accomplice. He had promised her he was working, and he was. He'd been talking to his mechanics, gathering whispers and fragments of information. He'd asked young Private Henderson about the temporary generator at headquarters. "That old German thing?" Henderson had said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Piece of junk!" We had to refuel it constantly. The low fuel light was always on. Colonel Thorne complained about the noise and the smell, said it was an eyesore next to his new garden. Frank had pressed him. "Constantly? More than usual for a generator that size?" "Way more, Master Sergeant," the private confirmed. "We all just figured it was ancient and burned fuel like crazy." Leaked a bit, too. Always a little slick of diesel on the ground beneath it. A little slick of diesel. On ground that was already becoming saturated with thousands of gallons of gasoline from the leaking pipeline. The generator wasn't just burning fuel. Frank suddenly knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to the language of machines, what had been happening. These specific German models, the KHD 400s, were famous for their over-engineering. They were built like tanks. And they had a primitive but robust diagnostic system, an internal log that recorded every fluctuation. Runtime, fuel levels, error codes, everything. It was all stored on a small, solid-state memory card, a mechanical black box. The generator hadn't just been sitting there. It had been observing. The saturated ground had likely interfered with its own fuel system, causing the sensors to give faulty low fuel readings. The constant alerts weren't a sign of the generator's failure. They were a symptom of the pipeline's failure. The generator had been seeing the leak for months, recording its existence in a steady, impartial stream of data. Back in her room, Eleanor came to the same conclusion. The generator was the German, and its memory was the key. But she was trapped, and Frank was a target. She needed to confirm her theory, to let him know what he had to look for. She looked around her Spartan room for a way to communicate. No pen, no paper. Her eyes landed on the small, standard-issue bar of soap by her sink. It was a desperate, almost crazy idea. Using a loose thread she carefully pulled from the hem of her uniform trousers, she began to painstakingly scratch a message into the soap's waxy surface. The letters were crude and shallow. Check the German's logbook. The next challenge was delivery. She waited, her nerves taut, for the evening guard change. She listened for the familiar footsteps on the walkway. When she heard Private Henderson's distinct shuffling gait approaching, she timed it perfectly. She knocked her metal water cup off her small table. It hit the concrete floor with a loud clang. The guard nearest her door turned, startled. "Everything all right in there, Sergeant?" "Yes, sorry," she called out. "Just clumsy." In that brief moment of distraction, Eleanor slid the bar of soap under her door. It came to rest just on the edge of the concrete path, partially hidden by the doorframe. She held her breath, praying Henderson would see it. She heard his footsteps falter for just a second, then continue on. A moment later, she peeked through the crack in her door. The soap was gone. Frank found the bar of soap left on his workbench, a silent message from Henderson. He scraped away the top layer and saw the words, "Logbook." It confirmed everything. He knew he had to move fast. Thorne's investigators could lock down the motor pool and impound the generator at any moment. Under the guise of clearing out old equipment for surplus auction, Frank made his way to the dim, dusty storage shed where the German generator had been unceremoniously dumped. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and forgotten machinery. He found it in a dark corner covered by a dusty tarp. Working quickly, he opened the main control panel. It took him a few minutes to locate the diagnostic port. It was an obsolete design. He retrieved an old ruggedized laptop from his toolbox, one he kept specifically for dealing with older military hardware. With a tangle of adapter cables, he finally managed to connect it. The old laptop whirred to life, its screen casting a ghostly green glow in the darkness. He ran the diagnostic software. The screen filled with lines of code, a language only he could understand. And then he found it. The data logs. He hit download. The progress bar crept across the screen with agonizing slowness. Every sound outside the shed made him jump. The file was a revelation. It was a diary of disaster. The logs showed the generator's fuel sensor registering warnings sporadically at first, then with increasing frequency over the past 6 months. On the day of the 50,000-gallon transfer, the logs went crazy. A cascade of low fuel alerts, emergency warnings, and sensor errors, one after another, creating an undeniable digital timestamp of the catastrophic leak. It was the impartial witness, the mechanical ghost that would hang Thorne. The download finished. Frank quickly copied the file onto a small encrypted thumb drive and shoved it deep into his pocket. A wave of relief washed over him. He had it. The smoking gun. Just as he was closing the laptop, he heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. The shed door creaked open, casting a long shadow across the floor. Frank's heart leaped into his throat. Standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the setting sun, was Captain Miller. His face was a mask of fear and conflict. "Master Sergeant?" Miller stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Colonel Thorne. He knows you've been digging around. He sent me to secure the area to confiscate any unauthorized materials." Frank stood up slowly, his body shielding the old laptop. In his pocket, the thumb drive felt as heavy as a block of lead. He was cornered. And Captain Miller, a young officer caught between a corrupt superior and his own conscience, had a choice to make that would determine both their fates. The air in the storage shed was thick with the smell of old grease and the unspoken tension of a decision that would change 3 lives. Captain Miller stood in the doorway, a young officer trapped between a direct order from a corrupt superior and the pleading in his own conscience. Master Sergeant Frank Miller didn't move. He simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet defiance, the key to Eleanor's freedom feeling like a small, dense star in his pocket. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He spoke to the man, not the rank. "You know what's on this drive, Captain?" "The truth," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You know Sergeant Vance is innocent. You were standing right there when she told Thorne about the discrepancy. You saw his face. You heard what he said." Miller flinched, the memory of his own silent compliance a fresh wound. "Men like Thorne," Frank continued, his gaze unwavering. "They're not leaders. They're just bullies in good uniforms. They break things and then find good people to pay the price. The only reason they ever win is because good soldiers like you stand by and let them." Each word was a carefully aimed blow against the captain's fear. Miller's career, his future, his ambition, it all seemed so important just a few minutes ago. Now, measured against the ruin of an innocent NCO's life and a potential environmental disaster, it felt hollow. He thought of Eleanor's face, her calm professionalism, as Thorne had belittled and framed her. He thought of the oath he had taken, an oath to the Constitution, not to the whims of a petty tyrant. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, Captain Miller's shoulders slumped. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet Frank's steady gaze. "What do we do, Master Sergeant?" he asked, his voice cracking. The alliance was forged. Their plan was desperate, a single roll of the dice. Going to the base commander was useless. Thorne was his subordinate, and the commander would instinctively protect his own. They had to leapfrog the entire base command structure. Miller, his mind now clear and focused, remembered a crucial piece of intelligence. The next morning, Brigadier General Ramirez, the deputy commander of the Army's Logistics Command, was arriving for a quarterly installation review. Ramirez had a reputation. She was tough, sharp as a tack, and had a zero-tolerance policy for incompetence and corruption. She was their only shot. The next morning, Fort Hemlock was a hive of activity. Lawns were manicured, brass was polished, and a palpable tension hung in the air. Thorne was in his element, striding around his headquarters like a king, confident that his problem, Sergeant Vance, was safely locked away. In her small room, Eleanor heard the commotion. The sounds of formal preparation, the barked orders, the hum of official vehicles. A cold dread filled her. She knew what a high-level visit meant. Everything had to be perfect. Her situation, the missing fuel, the leak, Thorne would have it all swept under the rug, with her name attached to the official blame. She sat on her bunk, feeling the last vestiges of hope slipping away. At the main headquarters, Captain Miller, armed with Frank's thumb drive, approached the general's aide. Using his position, he confirmed his scheduled spot to provide a Standard logistics briefing to the visiting general, a briefing Thorne assumed would be a routine presentation of falsified numbers and good news. Miller walked into the briefing room, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. General Ramirez sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by her aides. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s, her eyes missing nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne was there too, sitting near the general, looking pleased with himself. "Captain," the general said, her voice crisp. "Begin." Miller took a deep breath and began the briefing as planned, his voice steady as he went through the slides on fuel readiness and vehicle deployment. Thorne nodded along, a smug smile on his face. Then Miller reached the end of the prepared remarks. He paused and the room fell silent. "General," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "that concludes the standard briefing. However, there is a more urgent matter of operational readiness, environmental security, and command integrity I am compelled to bring to your attention." Thorne shot out of his chair. "Captain Miller, that's enough! The general doesn't have time for—" "Sit down, Colonel," General Ramirez commanded, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. She had seen the flash of desperation and resolve in the young captain's eyes. She turned her steely gaze back to Miller. "I have time. Continue, Captain." Thorne sank back into his chair, his face turning a blotchy red. Miller's words came out in a rush, a confession and an accusation all in one. He told them everything. Eleanor's initial report, Thorne's order to falsify the logs, the discovery of the leak, the framing of an innocent sergeant, and his own cowardly failure to act sooner. Then he walked to the presentation laptop and plugged in the thumb drive. The primary evidence, "General," he said, "comes from an impartial witness." On the large screen behind him, a spreadsheet of raw data appeared. These are the diagnostic logs from a German-made generator that was positioned directly over the pipeline. They provide a time-stamped record of a fuel system anomaly that proves the leak was a chronic, pre-existing condition. He clicked to the next file. Scanned images of the denied maintenance requests filled the screen, Thorne's arrogant red signature glowing like a brand. The room was utterly silent. The data was undeniable. The signatures were incriminating. The paper pusher's meticulous warnings, the old mechanic's stubborn search, the young captain's courageous confession, it all converged in this single damning moment. Thorne's face had gone from red to a ghastly, corpse-like white. He was finished. General Ramirez stared at the screen for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she slowly turned her head and fixed her gaze on Thorne. The contempt in her eyes was absolute. "Colonel," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you are a disgrace to that uniform." She nodded to the MPs standing guard at the door. "Take this man into custody. He is relieved of his command, effective immediately." As the MPs escorted a stunned and sputtering Thorne from the room, the general turned back to her aide. "Find Sergeant Eleanor Vance. I want her released from confinement and brought to this office. Now, I want to hear her report personally." 20 minutes later, Eleanor was escorted into the same briefing room. She was blinking in the bright fluorescent lights, her mind braced for another interrogation, another accusation. Instead, she saw General Ramirez at the head of the table. She saw Captain Miller, who gave her a look of profound apology and respect. And standing by the wall, looking immensely relieved, was Frank. General Ramirez gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat, Sergeant." Eleanor sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. The general looked down at the file in front of her, then back up at Eleanor. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence. The logs, the maintenance requests, the statements. It seems," she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips, "that you're not a paper pusher. You're the only one on this entire post who was actually doing their job." She leaned forward slightly. "Well done, Sergeant." The words, simple, direct, and full of respect, were like a balm on a raw wound. Eleanor felt the tension she had carried for days finally begin to dissolve, and she gave a slow, grateful nod. In the weeks that followed, justice moved with military efficiency. Sterling Thorne was court-martialed, found guilty of dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and making false official statements. He was stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged. The story of his downfall became a cautionary tale on the base. Eleanor was publicly exonerated, and General Ramirez personally pinned the Army Commendation Medal to her uniform for her integrity and unwavering commitment to duty. Captain Miller received a formal letter of reprimand for his initial hesitation, but a note was added to his file commending his ultimate courage in exposing the truth. He became a better officer for it. Frank, the quiet hero, decided to postpone his retirement for another year, just to make sure the base's new commander was up to his standards. 6 months later, Sergeant First Class Eleanor Vance stood on a small rise overlooking the now-repaired section of pipeline. The Georgia sun was warm on her face. The scar in the earth was still there, a faint brown line against the green, but new grass was already pushing its way through the soil. She was no longer the woman who was mocked in the motor pool, no longer the underestimated paper pusher. She was the sergeant who had stood her ground, who had trusted the facts, and who had brought the truth to light. She had earned her place, not with bluster or bravado, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of her own character. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that was a power no one could ever take from her.